Okay, welcome to the Witness at the Border webinar for today. We titled Biden's Proposed Asylum Ban, a Disaster for Children and Families. Our webinar today, we have guests Alex Miller and Casey Revkin, and our program today will be moderated by Margaret Seiler. Margaret is part of the Witness at the Border leadership team, and she will introduce our guests and lead a discussion with them. If you would like to submit any questions, please use the Q&A function to submit questions for the panel. You are also welcome to use the chat if you want to chat amongst each other, but we will not be monitoring the chat for questions that we'll respond to. So questions you'd like the panel to respond to, please use the Q&A. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret, and there you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. Welcome, everybody. Many of you are familiar with Witness at the Border, but if you're not, the Witness Project began outside the migrant child detention tent facility in Tornillo, Texas in 2018. Our focus began with migrant children, so we thought it was important to discuss the proposed asylum ban in relation to children and families. Welcome to Alex Miller and Casey Revkin. Alex is director of the Immigration Justice Campaign at the American Immigration Council, a nonprofit organization. The campaign's mission is to fight for due process and justice for immigrants, for a system without detention and with guaranteed access to counsel. Alex is an attorney based in Tucson, Arizona. Casey Revkin is executive director and co-founder of Each Step Home, a nonprofit organization that helps separated migrant families navigate the reunification process. Casey is a financial expert based in Los Angeles, California. So first, I just wanted each one of our panelists to just give us a quick intro to the mission and work of their organization. Would you like to start, Casey?
Sure. So Each Step Home was founded a few years ago. Before that, I was a financial analyst and didn't know anything about immigration. In 2018, I saw that they were separating families at the border, and I just thought, this is awful. Like, what can I do? And I started volunteering to reunite families. And along the way, we figured out that there are children who either came here alone or got separated at the border, and they're in detention, being held by the government, and they have families on the outside, usually parents, who have to apply to get them released to them. And these families don't know where to start. It's like this very overwhelming process. If my child was being held in some government facility, the process to get them back would feel very overwhelming to me. And we, like the first girl I helped, it took a long time to get her out. But after doing this a few times, I realized this was a process I knew how to navigate. I had done it a few times and I could help these families. So we founded this organization to help to do just that.
Thank you. And Alex?
Yeah, happy to jump in. The Immigration Justice Campaign is a department at the American Immigration Council. It was largely a response to the kind of environment we confronted back in 2017 at the beginnings of the Trump administration, trying to respond to some of the more draconian and anti-immigrant policies that were coming out of that administration at the time. What we essentially do is try to coordinate pro bono legal services for individuals facing potential removal, whether in detention, whether previously impacted by the so-called migrant protection protocols or remain in Mexico, or people seeking more durable solutions to staying in safety in the United States. We take those learnings from our work and partnerships on the ground to inform the policy work that the broader council does and to fight for a more just immigration system.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the first question we have is just, how did we get here? And I was hoping, Alex, you could give us some context. Can you give us some context around the Biden administration's recent proposal of this asylum, or some call it a transit ban? Thank you.
Yeah, happy to do so. The Biden administration inherited a really complicated and troubling immigration context when they walked into office in January of 2021. Many of us had hoped that the beginning of the administration would mean the end of some of these more detrimental immigration policies that we had seen under the prior administration, but that has proved incredibly challenging. The main player when we look at the border context right now is Title 42. It is a little used public health law that the prior administration, the Trump administration, seized on to exclude asylum seekers at the border, supposedly due to public health. We now know, and it's pretty well documented, that those public health interests were pretextual, and that the goal was really to exclude asylum seekers. The Biden administration, since they took office, has tried on a number of occasions to eliminate Title 42 and to restore access to asylum, but has been blocked by the courts, and in fact has in the end expanded the application of Title 42 to populations that weren't previously returned to Mexico. What we're looking at now is, with the end of the public health emergency on May 11th, a slated end to Title 42 border closures on that same date. And the administration is struggling to combat what is a really complicated political scenario where people are myopically focused on border encounters and how to reduce the number of migrants encountered at the border, rather than how to restore a healthy immigration system where migrants have access to asylum. That is where you see this asylum ban or asylum transit ban come into play in that broader context. And what this proposed rule does is it essentially says that individuals who are seeking asylum in the United States are presumptively barred or assumed not to qualify for asylum if they don't either access the asylum system through the government's proposed mechanisms, meaning using CBP-1 or a phone application that the government has created to schedule an appointment at a port of entry, or entering the country through a parole program, or if that individual does not first seek asylum in transit on their way to the United States. And what we know is that, this is a reinvigoration of a Trump policy from 2019, and the impact was incredibly harsh then, significantly restricting access to asylum. And we expect the impact to be the same now, that people who are fleeing persecution will be denied access to protection and will be returned to their countries of origin.
Wow, thank you. And so, Casey, again, how did we get here? You've been involved in this work since the family separation crisis of 2018 under the Trump administration. From your perspective, has anything changed under the Biden administration?
Well, yes and no. For historical context, in 2017 and 2018, what we all learned about in 2018 was that Trump had been separating children from parents at the border, and people got outraged, and a judge came in and ruled and said, you can't do that anymore, which was good, but that didn't end family separation. Two things happened. One, they still were looking for any excuse to separate a family. Like I helped this tiny little boy and his dad who were separated because they came to the border and they looked at the dad and they looked at the boy and they looked at the Xeroxed birth certificate and they said, this isn't real. And they threw it out. And they threw it out, and they took the boy away, and they took the dad away, and they took him to detention, and he was almost deported. I helped this other family, this father who was taken with his daughter into the CPB holding facility, which are freezing cold, and he caught pneumonia. And then one of the ways they can separate a child is if they feel like if there's a communicable disease. So they gave this dad pneumonia. He caught pneumonia. Then they said he was a risk to his daughter. So they took his daughter away and put her in detention. And then they didn't detain him. They just released him on the street without his daughter. And he was just devastated. Somebody from another organization we work with just found him just crying. And it took 3 months to reunite them. So that still happened. And
that happened under Biden?
That happened under Trump. But then under Trump, he instituted what was called the MPP, which closed the border and made people adjudicate their asylum cases in Mexico. And then when COVID happened, he replaced that with Title 42. And then when Biden came into office, he continued Title 42. And Alex just talked about what's been happening with that. Title 42 and this new asylum ban continues to separate families. It separates children from their parents, usually their mothers, in this very heartbreaking way. Because what happens is these moms flee their home country, like for their lives. They come to the border with their little kids. They either cross illegally or they try to cross. There's no way to apply for asylum. So they end up crossing illegally. They get sent back. They're incredibly vulnerable because they have these tiny kids and they're women and ever to these gangs at the border. They realize that Mexico is not safe. They realize they can't go home. And they make this, but they know that kids will not be sent back if they arrive alone. And so they make this horribly heartbreaking choice. They said, like, I can't keep my kids safe with me, so I'm going to send them over the border alone. So they choose to self-separate, but it's really our immigration policy that's separating them. Right. And something that's always frustrated me, but like really hit home for me in the last few weeks as we've been dealing with this one particularly vulnerable case, is they can't then just walk their child up to a port of entry and say, here's my kid, take them, they're requesting asylum. They have to pay somebody to smuggle their child across the border in these very dangerous circumstances. It's very expensive and it's very dangerous. And then to leave their child there to then be alone and and wait for somebody to come and find them and then, have the written or say they want asylum. It's very harsh and very heartbreaking. And this is happening with the current policy, and the asylum ban will continue to separate families in this way.
Yeah. Wow. So, Alex, the Immigration Justice Campaign is focused on ending the detention of immigrants. How do you think that this proposed asylum ban is going to affect asylum seekers? First of all, and then maybe you could just spend a couple minutes also talking about the rumor that the administration may bring back family detention.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly hard to say and speculative. Right now we're dealing with a proposed rule, and theoretically, the administration should be looking at comments and revising the rule before they implement it. But as the rule is currently written, the proposal essentially is to use these kind of two mechanisms: how someone entered the United States and whether they first sought asylum before entering the United States, to determine whether they qualify for asylum whatsoever. And there are certain exceptions and exemptions to that general rule, but we have to look at how this rule will actually play out on the ground. And what we've seen in the past is that the problems start immediately, right? You look at the ports of entry, right? And under Title 42, the border closure, like Casey was saying, people could not seek asylum at ports of entry. They were forced through dangerous, irregular paths. We created and reinforced an incredible industry for organized crime groups who benefited from these anti-migrant policies and will continue to do so. But there's a serious question as to what will actually happen at ports. They've been closed for 3 years. If someone goes to the port to seek asylum and has not first signed up through CBP-1, will they be turned away? Will it be a new form of metering, or will they be processed? the rule suggests that they should be processed, but just may not qualify for asylum because they didn't first sign up through CBP-1. And we know that there are incredible concerns already with the use of CBP-1 for Title 42 exemptions. For instance, it's only available in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, which means anyone who speaks another language may not be able to effectively use that application, and the burden will be on asylum seekers to demonstrate that they're not able to access CBP-1. That all happens in a black box, right? And that those interactions with CBP and then with USCIS asylum officers, there are incredible concerns about the level of accountability and how much insight we will have as to what happens there. From there, in those asylum interviews, whether in CBP or Border Patrol custody, it heightens the standard of what individuals have to demonstrate to be able to enter and start going through the process of seeking asylum. If you did not seek asylum through a prioritized means, CBP-1 or parole, and if you did not seek asylum first and be denied asylum in a transit country, it means you will fail your credible fear interview and have to demonstrate that you can meet that higher standard of reasonable fear. All of this is supposed to work relatively quickly, and we have real concerns about access to counsel during this process, and this ultimately just resulting in rapid expulsion of asylum seekers without meaningful access to due process. I could go way deeper down this rabbit hole, but I think circling back to the impact on children and the secondary question about family detention, I think there are two important things. Like Casey was saying, our policies have incentivized family separation for the protection of children, and this policy is likely to do the same. Children are exempted from this policy, unaccompanied children are exempted from this policy, which creates that same pressure and tension of a parent who's looking out for their child's interest first and foremost and willing to sacrifice their own. And that's an incredibly difficult decision to be forced to make. I think beyond that, it seems to me that this expansion of detention and the rumors of family detention will likely have a really harmful intersection with this asylum transit ban or asylum ban, meaning that families will be detained together to facilitate use of this policy, meaning rapid determinations about credible fear and then reasonable fear, and then rapid removal from the country. All the while perpetrating additional harms. We know detention is particularly harmful to children, and leading to bad outcomes, right? In our system, whether you deserve asylum is supposed to be based on whether you faced persecution in your country of origin or have a well-founded fear of future persecution based on a protected ground. It is not supposed to be based on how you enter the United States or whether you sought asylum in another country first, especially considering the reality that many of these transit countries do not have functional or meaningful asylum systems, and that we know, in particular, Black and Indigenous migrants face a lot of the same harms in transit to the United States.
Wow. Casey, what would you like to add? As much as we know about the asylum ban at this point, the proposed ban, what would you like to add about how you think it would affect families and children? And then the other thing I'm thinking about is just how difficult the new application to apply for asylum, CBP-1, is already for people to use. And, I feel like they're sort of putting forth these new barriers.
Yeah, what I feel like I can add to these is just individual stories of why this, or what it's like for these parents. I mean, we worked with a mom who was still breastfeeding when she decided to send her daughter over the border alone. And it was just so, I mean, it's hard to stop breastfeeding in any circumstance, but yeah, these women are so desperate and they're so determined to keep their kids safe that they make these horrible decisions that they should never have to make. We are helping this little boy now. He's 7 years old. He came to the border with his mom, who was HIV positive and dying. And her greatest wish was to make it into the US, to give her son over to her sister so her sister could care for her son when she died. And there is a system at the border. If you get connected and you get to the right NGO and they see your case, they can recommend you for humanitarian parole. And we found an organization that would recommend her, and she was dying, and there was a clear need for, like, they thought she would get approved. But before her application was processed, she died. And then now we have this orphan boy, and they're like, well, now there's no medical emergency. We don't think there's no medical emergency, and we don't think we can let him in. I mean, that's how messed up our asylum system is right now. That now that he's orphaned and he's all alone and but he's not with his dying mom, then there's no easy system to parole him in and get him into his aunt.
Get him to his aunt. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah. And we're working through it. We're like, well, what is the next thing we can do? Well, we have to prove that he's an orphan. So we had to get her cremated and get her death certificate, and that cost money, which he didn't have. So our organization paid for it. It's like one hurdle after another, and we will find a way, maybe, but it's like, it shouldn't be this hard, and we should be protecting kids like that. Yeah.
It reminds me also of how many children are separated if they're not with their parent when they're, seeking asylum, if they come with a brother or an aunt. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue. This has been policy forever, that any child who arrives at the border with a caregiver who is not their parent, even if it's their grandmother who's raised them their whole life, if it's their aunt who's raised them their whole life, if it's their uncle, they will automatically be separated. And the government says this because they say they need to, that this grandmother could clearly be a trafficker, that it's too hard to verify at the border that these people are related. I mean, it's an extra step. If it's a parent and a child, you look at the parent's ID and you look at the child's birth certificate, and you call the consulate and make sure the ID is real and the birth certificate is real, and you do that. If it's a grandparent, you need another birth certificate in between, but that's like something they could invest in. They can invest in investigators at the border to do that extra background check, to do the extra bit of work to prove these grandmothers are related to their grandkids at the border. It's just a matter of putting the resources where they belong, and we would need to, and it would end up being cheaper. I mean, it's very expensive to keep kids in detention. And if they put the resources there at the border with people, with social workers who could do this background checks, who could verify these familial relationships, they would spare the children this trauma of separation.
Right. So, Alex, do you want to talk about the public comment campaign and how important it is that we've had, I believe, 12 more days to make public comments that the government is going to have to read about the proposed asylum ban?
Sure. Yeah. So this whole thing has to do with the strictures of administrative law. So this asylum ban is a notice of proposed rulemaking, which means the Biden administration is putting forth this rule saying that it intends to implement it and asking the public for its feedback. And so we have until March 27th to provide the government with our thoughts on this asylum ban. And so there is a website, noasylumban.us, where we have facilitated the process for individuals to make comments and register and raise their voice against the asylum transit ban. we've created a template, and the most important thing to know is that the government will ignore duplicative comments. So you can't just use the template. You have to tell them a little bit about what you believe and what you think. And so we would ask you to reflect if you've done any work in the immigration field, if you've ever been to the border, if you are passionate about asylum, if you've worked with refugees, it's important to voice a little bit of your own perspective about what is going on and why this proposed rule is so bad, why it is such a departure from our obligations and duties under international and domestic law, and frankly, constitutional law, to provide a process for individuals to seek asylum in our country. I noted a couple of questions in the chat that I will try to clarify now, since I do have the mic. I think one is like, does this rule, if the rule doesn't apply to you, does that mean that you get asylum or you're able to seek asylum? It means you're able to seek asylum. The process will start there. So we're not asking that asylum be handed out willy-nilly. What we're asking for is for people to have a meaningful chance to defend their claims, a process that is fair and accessible. And this rule really stands against all of that.
Right.
I will add that you don't, even if your connection to this is that you watch this webinar and one of these stories rang, like connected with you, then use that when you're adding your public comment. Just make it unique, add what you can. Anyone can do it. The more voices, the better.
Yeah, and Casey raised a point about how expensive it is to keep people in detention. I mean, just talking about the expense of the militarization of the border, it's probably a lot more expensive to beef up the Center for Border Patrol than bring some social workers or others down to the border who could help create a more humane, welcoming system. So again, we have 12 days to make public comments. And before we go to our Q&A, I'm just wondering if you all have last thing you want to say, or any questions you have for each other. And then I think we have a bunch of questions from our audience.
Yeah, let's go to the questions.
Sure, questions, why not?
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from Alan that I'll combine together. He said, do you have any sense that the proposed regulations might not be finalized? And the second part is, if the proposed regulations are finalized and implemented, do you have a sense of how many asylum seekers will be allowed in, more or less than are currently allowed in?
I can take a stab at starting to answer this question. Part of the impetus or we believe that part of the impetus for this proposed rule, this asylum ban, is a reaction to the fears related to border encounters after Title 42 ends on May 11th. The timing of the rule is that it would be implemented in tandem as Title 42 sunsets. And so the rule doesn't put forth a limitation on the number of people that can seek asylum, and we're unsure of how many people will end up seeking asylum at ports or crossing irregularly and surrendering themselves to Border Patrol. But what we do know is that it will fundamentally shift what that process of seeking asylum looks like, and it will mean that many more people are removed from the country before they're even able to really defend their case in front of an immigration judge. In terms of whether I think realistically this rule won't move forward, I mean, we can hope and we can pray, but it seems like the administration is very committed to this process, which is incredibly disappointing. We saw the asylum transit ban in 2019, and not only did it lead to inhumane outcomes, it made the asylum process significantly more complicated. At the time, it meant, asylum can benefit your derivatives, meaning your family members, your spouse, your children. And it multiplied the amount of work pro bono and nonprofit attorneys had to do defending asylum claims. I had clients who were granted withholding of removal, which is a lower level of benefit. It means basically they can't expel you to persecution in your country of origin, but there's no pathway to legal permanent residency or citizenship. And they were granted that status, but for the asylum ban. Right? People that otherwise would qualify for asylum will be denied asylum because of a rule like this. And it's incredibly disappointing that in so many ways, we're back at stage one, right? We're back to how things felt in 2019.
We have a question from Patty Brown. Why would someone fleeing violence apply for asylum in Mexico, which the U.S. knows is also dangerous? I think one could have a case for credible fear in doing that, it seems to me.
Sounds more like a rhetorical question.
Right.
Patty is pointing out the inherent absurdity of this requirement, right? There's this notion of a safe third country, right? And we had a safe third country agreement with Canada, right? And you're supposed to know that there's a functional asylum system and that person would be safe, actually, in that country. And we know that the transit countries that people come through on their way to the southern border are not safe for many or most asylum seekers, whether it is because you're targeted for being a Black or Indigenous migrant or you are LGBTQ+. There are so many ways that people can face harm, or just being a migrant. The so-called migrant protection protocols, or Title 42, organized crime groups and other bad actors specifically targeted migrants upon return to Mexico because of the fact that they were migrants, because of their vulnerability. And you would think that we would have an interest in protecting people from that instead of requiring them to endure that or to go through a farcical asylum process in a country that doesn't have the infrastructure to support them or the will.
Patty has a second question about how many children are in private homes or detention facilities right now and have family who are looking for them. I can give the number of how many kids are in currently in HHS custody, because I heard that number this morning. It's 7,810 that are in HHS custody. But Casey, do you have a sense of how many of those unaccompanied minors that are in custody have a family member who is looking for them or wants to be reunited with them?
So the government says that it's 80% of those kids have a parent or a close family member that wants to be reunited with them. And my guess is it's actually closer to 90%, but let's just give the government the benefit of the doubt and go with their 80% number. So that means so many of these kids, their parent came here first, got settled, and then once they were settled, they missed their kids and they sent for their kids to join them. So in these cases, you have a child locked up by HHS and a parent and that reunion should be so simple. It should be like, oh, you're their mom. We have your kid. Here you go. Like, let's verify you're really their mom and send it over. The process on average for a parent and a child takes 22 days. A parent has to fill out this 20-page application, submit a ton of backup documents, and wait for the government to review it and for whatever else they might need just to get their own child back. I can't imagine waiting 3 weeks just to get my child released to me. And then so that's probably about 50% of the kids in detention. And then the other 30% are very close family members And on average, it takes them 33 days to reunite them. And then the last little bit are the kids who have distant family members, and it takes longer to reunite them, and that makes sense.
Okay. So there's a question here that says, can we also name the news that's coming out about migrant children being abused in labor abuse? This immigration system is setting up for labor abuses like this. It's connected. So we want to talk about that connection.
Yeah, I mean, Alex can probably speak to this a lot better, but the one of the main reasons why there were children here who feel like they have to work and take these jobs is because they are allowed in the country and their parents are not, because the border has been closed to adults for so long. If we would allow adults in, this would greatly decrease the number of children in these desperate situations who take these jobs that are these dangerous jobs. Another thing is that there are safe jobs for children to work, but they would need to get a work permit to do that. And it is cumbersome. It is difficult. It is hard for a child to navigate that process to get a work permit. And it takes months and months and months. And we could make that simpler. I mean, there's just the way our immigration structure is structured right now, it makes children incredibly vulnerable to this exploitation.
I'll jump in on that as well. I think, like, zooming out of the issue with children specifically, we have a system right now that makes it incredibly hard to seek protection. It takes a long time to seek protection, and it's really hard to get employment authorization. And so what we in effect do is create a system that pushes people to the margins in order to try to survive. And people who are at the margins in that way, if you're working under the table, anything like that, you are so incredibly vulnerable to exploitation. And we've created a system that time and time again pushes people into incredibly vulnerable situations where they are susceptible to exploitation and ultimately to trafficking. And then on the back end, you know, beyond asylum, there are protections for victims of trafficking and victims of crime in this country that are also really hard to access for migrants from time to time.
Okay, Alex, here's a question for you. How can the U.S. place a ban on seeking asylum when asylum is part of international law?
Yeah, this one is hard, and I think it's a bit of wordsmithing. I know there was also a question kind of about the compare and contrast between, you know, the Biden policy and the Trump policy, and in this instance, I think what the administration would say is this is not a ban. People can still seek asylum. It's just that if they are not able to, if they don't seek asylum the right way, or they don't seek asylum first in a transit country, then there's a rebuttable presumption that they don't qualify for asylum. But lo and behold, they'll have the chance in front of an asylum officer, again in a black box with very little accountability, to try to prove that they can meet this higher standard of reasonable fear of persecution or torture upon return. They can have an immigration judge review that decision in theory, but in practice, what has so often happened is that it's impossible. Things happen so quickly that there is no meaningful review. There is no meaningful access to counsel. And we are moving the standard to a place where so many people who have real fear and who will face persecution upon return to their countries will be erroneously excluded from the asylum process, and we will be causing real harm.
You know, I told the story earlier of under Trump about the excuses they would make to separate families And yes, that was under Trump, not under Biden, but those same people are still working at the border. And these are the people who are going to be making these decisions going forward. And they will look for any loophole and any excuse to keep families out.
So there's also a question here about how can you outline Biden's asylum policy and how it is different from 1, Trump's asylum policy, and 2, Obama's asylum policy?
I feel like this requires a dissertation.
A flow chart, right?
Yeah. So
I'm sorry. I just wanted to expand on what you said, Alex, which partially answers this. I think that the Biden administration feels like, well, this is not a ban on all asylum seekers. Therefore, what's the problem? Because they have, I can't remember the numbers, but they've said a certain number of people can definitely apply for asylum from certain countries, but they have to do it from their home country, which means they have to be able to pay for a plane ticket, right, to get here. So that's one difference. Like they've taken the all or nothing and made it piecemeal, so in their minds it looks better. Anyway, that's just my take.
Yeah, I think we're just so focused on border encounters at this point, right? We're so focused on these numbers that push us to forget the humanity of all of the people that are seeking asylum at the border. And the problem is not the numbers and the people trying to seek asylum. The problem is that our system doesn't work, and deterrence doesn't work for people fleeing persecution. They have nowhere to stay, right? And so what we need is a functional system that facilitates speedier resolution of cases, less reliance on detention, but does not rely on excluding people. Right? Like it seems like the only solution is to tell people not to come, right? That is how we fix the problem. We tell people not to come, but we know that geopolitical circumstances globally mean that migration is and will be a reality in perpetuity so long as there are people on Earth, right? And so if you look at Obama's policies versus Trump's policies versus Biden's policies, and family detention was a policy that happened under Obama. Reliance and use of detention was commonplace. Under Trump, we saw this slew of policies that attacked asylum seekers pretty directly, whether it was the transit ban in 2019 or the Remain in Mexico policy that forced many asylum seekers to adjudicate their claims from Mexico. Most of which had their claims denied, many of whom faced significant threat and harm in Mexico. And then ultimately Title 42. And, they're afraid of this chaos that will happen when Title 42 ends, or that they think will happen when Title 42 ends, but don't acknowledge the ways in which Title 42 created this chaos. We barred most asylum seekers from accessing asylum in the organized and orderly way that we supposedly want them to at ports. The issues that you hear about in Yuma, that is a direct result of Title 42, right? And we know from the last time that the Trump transit ban policy happened that it will lead to complicated proceedings and more resources that are needed to evaluate these claims, deploying USCIS asylum officers to do all of these interviews. And so I just really wish that we could focus, instead of on reducing the numbers, on how to manage those numbers in a humane way and give people the help and protection they need.
Okay, we have somebody who'd like to have me turn their microphone on to ask their question. The initials are HP, and they specifically have a question about the difference between detention centers and people being rejected at the border. So I think, so HP, I'm going to turn on your mic and let you ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have actually two questions. My name is Luis Arechiga. I am a Mexican national and have been living here in the United States for 20 some years already. And I'm really concerned about kids in the border. So my first question is, at the beginning when the government created these humongous detention centers all across the border, we started hearing stories of people that had been in these detention centers not for months, but actually years. I think I heard a case of somebody staying there for like 2 years or something like that. So nowadays, what is the average time of those immigrants staying in these detention centers nowadays? That's my first question. And the second question is, so in these detention centers all across the United States, I guess there's a total of maybe 100,000 immigrants being in these detention centers in New York, in the border, and everywhere else. What is the difference between the people that are being rejected and make wait at the border, and what is the criteria of people that are being accepted into these detention centers? That was my second question. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I can try to jump in and would invite anyone else to join. On the first question, kind of what is the average amount of time people spend in detention? I don't know that offhand. I can speak a bit to my personal experience representing asylum seekers in detention centers here in Arizona. And I had a client who was detained for 3 years. And it was because it was a particular social group case. It was a really complicated one, and the case is still ongoing. He ended up being released because of COVID precautions, but he had to sit in detention as his case ping-ponged from the immigration judge to the Board of Immigration Appeals to the Ninth Circuit and back down and back up, and it's still ongoing. There are also individuals who spend hours, days, weeks before taking voluntary departure or being rapidly having a prior removal reinstated, or sometimes a few months to get through a more straightforward asylum claim. So it really, really runs the gamut. In terms of the difference between the people that you might find in immigration detention versus the people being excluded at the border, it really depends on the context and the time. If we're talking about right now, people that are being pushed back at ports or being rapidly expelled under Title 42 by Border Patrol, those are individuals who are getting no, or theoretically no due process, right? Like, because of Title 42, the government is allowed to rapidly expel individuals to their country of origin or to Mexico, depending on their nationality and whether Mexico will take them. And that's what you heard in the news about Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans, that like they can now be rapidly expelled to Mexico in exchange for this cute little parole program that you can access if you have the documentation and you can afford a flight and you have a sponsor. But right now, people are just being rapidly expelled. In a world after Title 42, we don't know what that's going to look like. Theoretically, the courts have struck down the practice of metering, whereby the US government said, we don't have capacity at the port, you have to wait in this line. But it's unclear how, CBP1, this new application, will work, looking at port capacity and what's going to happen with asylum seekers at ports after Title 42 ends. We just don't know yet.
And I will just add that it's different for children. First of all, there's the holding centers at the border, the CPB detention centers, which everyone who is apprehended at the border who comes to a port of entry is held there for some amount of time. And then either they're expelled, right now they're expelled, or they're transferred, or they're released, or they're transferred to some sort of detention facility. The detention facilities for adults are run by the Department of Homeland Security. The detention facilities for kids are run by the Department of Health and Human Services, and inside a division of that called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And these are special centers that are built for children. They're not allowed to be held at the border for more than 3 days because those places are so awful. They have to be transferred to special facilities for children in that amount of time. I can also say that the government calls these places shelters, but our organization refers to them as detention centers because the kids are detained. They vary wildly in quality of care. Some of them might actually feel like shelters, and others are giant warehouses just packed with children, or tent cities like Witness at the Border originally was founded to oppose.
Okay. Which single official in the Biden administration do you think is most susceptible to public pressure to change this policy? Is anyone in particular a weak link and likely to cave?
I don't think I know enough about the insider baseball. I do think though, comment. Like the response to the comment campaign has been absolutely incredible. There are over 16,000 comments right now, which is a resounding and loud scream from the public saying, no, don't do this again. And if that feels hopeless, or, you know, I had said that it feels very likely that this rule will come into place, it still matters because it helps lay the groundwork for future litigation. Right? The administration is supposed to evaluate these comments and respond to the comments. And with this sort of loud and boisterous showing, it is incredibly hard for them to do that on the timeline they've given themselves. So do comment if you can.
I also think that speaking up and thanking the members of Congress who are speaking out is really important, because they need to also, when they speak up, hopefully the more of them speak up, the better.
Just thought, we've been having, I just wrote it down. It's noasylumban.us. We've been having trouble putting it in the chat. So
I've put it in the chat. I thought it's in the chat.
Oh, yes, for some reason. Okay.
It's not going to everyone, or I'm not sure. So just in case, it's noasylumban.us, and then there's tons to read about it on that page, and then a place to enter your comments, and it has a template, but you want to edit the template and really add something personal to it. And the more comments they have, just the more chance we have to stop this.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you. I'm sorry. I thought it had been put in the chat a couple of times, but there's a comment by Harvey. It says, would you agree that the proposed rule is a categorical ban on the ability to apply for asylum, but that it would not be unlawful for the agency to give priority to those who use the app first, assuming that the flaws in the app facial recognition translation are mitigated?
That's a hard one, Harvey. I think your question kind of zeroes in on this tension between having a fair asylum system with meaningful access for asylum seekers and the desire to incentivize behavior that helps the system function, right? And part of what, this rule seems to be trying to do is to incentivize people to go to ports and people to sign up in advance. But one thing is clear in our domestic law is that it's not supposed to matter how you seek asylum. Like, it explicitly says that you can seek asylum whether you seek asylum at a port or enter without inspection, meaning between ports. So finding ways to incentivize behavior that makes the job easier for Customs, Border Protection, and Border Patrol is one thing, but excluding people wholesale from access to asylum based on how they enter the United States is very likely unlawful. And Trump had attempted to implement an EWI ban, or enter without inspection. EWI is the shorthand, under his administration, and it was struck down in court.
see. There was a question here about from Sarah, do you have any theories as to why the Biden administration has been consistently pushing the deterrence model rather than the humanitarian model, particularly given his campaign promises? I mean, yeah.
I don't want to guess at what.
I don't want to guess either. I don't want to speculate, but I think it's worth pointing to the courts. And I think there have been some really disappointing setbacks that were handed to the administration by the courts, both with respect to remain in Mexico and respect to trying to end Title 42. And it's really curious that you have these two policies that are questionable legally, like whether they were even lawful in the first place was in question and even hotly litigated. But then when it came down to Biden trying to roll back these policies, those attempts were enjoined in court. And so in some ways, you know, the rug was pulled out from underneath him and he was forced to implement some of these policies. But in other ways, he took that from the courts and he expanded upon them. And right now with the asylum transit ban and with the rumors about family separation or family detention, pardon me, that's not the courts, right? Like that's what's coming out of the administration and its agencies. And so it's incredibly disappointing that this is where we've landed and seems to be tied to, again, this pressure, this immense political pressure coming from the border related to border encounters.
So, and Joshua Rubin, who's the founder of Witness at the Border, says Yael Schlacker just posted that a court decision she had briefed for would prevent those, quote, conditions like where they cross would be illegal to apply for asylum policy. Do you have any comment on that?
I think I missed what you said, and I haven't read that yet. So
okay. That's
responding incorrectly.
That's fair. Okay, we'll have to. Is it fair to assume that this is from Adam, is it fair to assume that the administration and Democrats in Congress who are supporting this policy already understand the human costs of this policy and just don't care or think it's an acceptable cost to bear compared to any other alternative? Or is it conceivable that hearing more about the unnecessary harm they are causing would persuade them to change course?
We always have to believe that it helps to tell these stories and to say this. We want these comments because somebody has to read all of them, and it will make a difference.
Yeah, impossible to know, but I agree with Casey wholeheartedly, right? And it's not just about making the point and trying to help people understand. It's also about giving people an opportunity to have some agency and to tell their own stories and to take some power back in what are incredibly disempowering circumstances.
Okay, hold on. I'm just trying to get down to see if we've got.
I see one question which is about the fact that we don't have comprehensive immigration reform. We have an enforcement only approach. And the questioner is saying until we get some real conversations on real policy, comprehensive immigration reform, as it is called, what is the best thing that we can do? I mean, we're saying today the best thing we can do right now is to make public comments on this asylum ban. If there's anything else you all wanted to add to that.
No, I think that's the most important thing you can do right now. We have 12 days to make these comments, and not only should you write one, but reach out to a friend, reach out to 3 friends, and triple your effort. Help them write one.
And just to say, I think 11 days, the 27th, March 27th is the last day. And I think you're right. It's incredibly disappointing that this is where we are. I think there are some places on the margins where we can hope for better. We've got our Afghan evacuees whose paroles are coming up in the fall, and every hope that, parole will be extended. The same for Ukrainians. There are places on the margins where we can hope for small wins, but, barring broader comprehensive immigration reform, we're kind of constrained to these little battles, but they're still meaningful fights.
Yeah, I agree. So we have had some really great questions, and there's still a few more, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up because it's a little after 6. And I just wanted to thank Alex and Casey for being here. I want to remind everybody that the link to make your public comment is noasylumban.us. And please go to witnessattheborder.org. I believe Carla put links to the American Immigration Council and Each Step Home to their websites in the chat. And we're just really glad to have so many people here and involved. And thank you so much for your questions. And we'll hope to see you next time. Carla, did either of you, who wants to say goodbye, have a last comment?
I just put the witnessattheborder.org link in the chat, as well as the welcomewithdignity.org link in the chat. And yes, we previously put the other two, but while somebody's saying their final words, I will repost the Each Step Home and the American Immigration Council links. So if somebody wants to
just want to say thank you for having us. It was really a pleasure to come and talk to you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Glad to be here.